Okay, the last presentation of this morning is Miriam Sang-Ah Park, who Dr. Park is a principal lecturer at Nottingham Trent University and a psychologist and researcher in the international lead for the School of Social Sciences. Her PhD is in cross-cultural psychology from Brunel University in the UK, and her research has always had a focus on the significance of culture in shaping the daily lives, beliefs, and behaviors of peoples and groups around the world. And she will be addressing us today on getting old and staying young, the question mark, getting old, staying young. These academics, they give us these titles. Studying older adults' well-being. And I think, again, this is going to be something that has a lot of impact here. And cross-cultural psychology is a very, very interesting area of study. And in actual fact, IFOR organized the International Association on Cross-Cultural Psychology's conference when it was in Japan in 2016. So we do have a link with that association as well. So without further ado, Dr. Sang-Ah Park.
Right, it is really nice to be addressed by my Korean name. So thank you, Joe, for that. Really happy to be here today. I really like this conference. I've come back. I was here last year and I really liked the people. I really liked the conversations that I had. So I wanted to come back. So really glad to be here. Thank you, IFOR, for inviting me back. So just a bit of my personal history, I guess, because I think that kind of puts you in the context of why I'm doing the kind of research that I do. So I'm a very international person, goes with the IFOR theme. So I'm originally from South Korea, and then I went to Canada to study as an international student. So I've sympathized with those people who are very international students, immigrants, migrants, refugees, all of them. And then I went to UK to do my PhD, and then I worked for an Australian university in Malaysia. And then I went back to the UK to work. So I've been around, I've seen things, and that kind of really brings me to think about how we tend to differ. I mean, in many ways, we are similar across the globe, but at the same time, because of the cultural context, we tend to think and behave differently. So that has been sort of the focus of my research right from the beginning. And that's how I started my PhD research on family relationships across cultures. And over time, I do not want to offend any psychologists in the room, but I tend to think that we focus on the problems a bit too much, that we focus on the pathology of people being ill mentally and physically, and that we do not pay enough attention on our personal strengths, resilience. We go through really terrible things, but we often come out okay. And I felt that the academic research is not addressing that part of the question as much. So that has been sort of the focus of my research over the past years, looking at well-being and resilience across different groups. And that meant that I researched that across cultures, but also across groups. And one of the things that I began to take interest in was the well-being of people across different generational groups. And the reason why I got into aging research was because looking at young people's well-being, it felt like a lot of young people are not happy because they feel relatively deprived. Yeah. So in South Korea and Japan, that used to be very much the kind of cultures where the elders were respected. That seemed to be changing really quickly, not because young people want to be ageist or biased or stereotypical, but because they felt that they are never going to have that good life that the older generation has. You know, they regard the older generation as the people who've had that wealth, who've had the good life, who was able to afford a good house and, good life. And as young people, that we are never going to have that because we are going to run out of pension. The older people are, using all the healthcare services. And at the end of the day, we are not going to be left with any money. So that seems to be the fear that seems to live with the younger people. So then I thought that I want to look at aging more as a social phenomenon rather than just looking at older adults per se, and try to understand it as a bit of a societal issue that we need to tackle as psychologists, social scientists, and scientists in general. So this is sort of the summary of the talk that I'm going to give. So I'm going to start a bit with the background, and I think I will. A lot of what I have to say resonates with what Adela shared already of what we are seeing, and a bit of the conceptual analysis, because we need to start with a good conceptual understanding of what we are looking at in order to do good research, in my opinion. So I'm going to share a bit of my thoughts on that. And then I'm going to present to you a series of research that I'm conducting. So I'm going to present a bit of the two exploratory initial studies that I've conducted, so that you get a sense of where I'm going, and then a bit of what next as well. So we've already talked about this, and a lot of us in the room are experts on this topic. So we know that societies are aging. We know that this is something that we need to tackle. We know that we have more older adults than before. So yes, we will have to do something about it, but let's look at it from different angles. So what you are going to hear from me today is a bit of the different angle. We talk about dementia, we talk about frailty, we talk about decline in health, how to provide healthcare for older adults who are not very well. But I also want to pay attention to those who are aging relatively well, or those who want to think about how to age well as well. And if you think about it, not many of us here are actually at the peak of our life. So I'm sorry to say, because biologically, 25 is, I think, the peak of our cognitive physical performance. So most of us in this room are actually aging already. And we are not at the peak anymore. Let's face it, we are all in a decline. So it's just a matter of at what stage of that decline we are in, and thinking about the lifespan, how to have a good life regardless of where we are in that stage or phases of decline, right? Sorry, that's a bit depressing. And Adela has touched upon this already, but at what age does old age actually begin, right? So, can we define that? And once again, who is defining that, right? So are we as sort of the younger people defining that old age for those who are in that age group? Or do we let the older adults choose? But who are the older adults, right? And society tends to define the old age by things like retirement. So if you're not providing full-time employment and the kind of provision to the society, then you're kind of old. And also, that loss of full-time job and identity also tends to make people feel a bit older, or maybe not as useful, which is not a good way of thinking. Frailty, poor health, decline of various functions. But at the end of the day, we don't really know what that means. We don't really know what old age is. So I think that is something that we need to think about a bit more carefully, rather than to just kind of put people under that broad category and become ageist as a result of that. So I'm presenting a bit of a different angle here. So I think Kevin yesterday used a really nice term. I think he said multi-perspectival lens, and I really liked it. So we can have different perspectives. So yes, dementia research is much needed. We need to think about how to prevent people from dementia. But at the same time, we can apply different angles to look at this population, or look at this as a societal issue or phenomenon, and think a bit more carefully about it. So I put that data and the stat as a first point. So in the UK currently, based on data from 10 or 11 years ago, 7.1% of the population over 65 have dementia. So that is a significant stat. That is quite a large number of people who are suffering from this really, really horrible illness. But then we need to also think about the other 92% is what I'm thinking, right? And this is generally what psychologists do. And once again, I don't want to be stoned here, so please don't. But, we talk about depression, we talk about autistic spectrum disorder, but very rarely we talk about the relatively healthy, relatively normal people who can do better if we focus a bit more on their actual well-being and resilience. So that's sort of the question that I'm raising here. There are a lot of very healthy older adults who still want to contribute, who are actually still contributing to the society, to the humankind, that we are not looking at. Yeah. So most of the academic research still in gerontology and research to do with aging is looking at dementia, fall, rehabilitation, dying, but not as much on the older adults' well-being. So that's sort of the focus that I wanted to have in my research. So looking at lifespan perspective, all of us are aging anyways. So let's not kind of divide groups here, because if you apply sociopsychological lens, once we start to other the other groups, we tend to kind of start to make stereotypes, start to be biased. So I want to do a bit less of that. All of us are aging together, so let's think about aging well, right? So the population is much healthier than before, and that's another thing that we need to recognize. And I'm going to present you with a bit of data a bit later on as well. So yes, I want to break away from that kind of dominance of very biomedical perspectives where we look at the negative aspects of aging, but now let's look at the positive aspects of aging as well, right? So I'm promoting my collaborators' research here. So this is freshly in press. I think this actually became online first just last week, and it is going to be published in June. So he's conducted a series of meta-analyses, and he also looked at his own data that he collected over 10 years. And what he finds across those different data sets is that cognitive functioning of older adults are improving, for sure. And, this is statistically significant. So in the younger group, the cognitive functioning hasn't improved. It has stayed relatively the same. But for older adults group over the age of 65 has actually improved. So we are dealing with a bit of a different population. And the fact that looking at data just over 10 years that we see that difference is another thing that we need to note, I think. So people are living longer, they are healthier, and contrary to some of our biases, they are actually cognitively very capable as well. So going back to what I said about concepts, I think it's really important that we pay attention to the concepts that we use as well and the kind of language that we use in our research. So successful aging was already better. So Roy and Kahn's 97 definition of successful aging already addresses that there are other aspects that one needs to look at in studying aging, such as social relationships and productive activity. So that's really good. But as you can see, that still starts with the kind of understanding that only comes with relative lack of illnesses or disabilities. So that is still very biomedical in the definition, I thought. So then I dug up a bit further and I found other concepts and definitions that are somewhat better or at least a bit more flexible. Such as optimal, productive, effective aging. That's a bit technical. And also aging well, healthy aging, all of those. And the concept that I liked the most was actually positive aging, because that felt like that encaptures the kind of positive mental health that I think that we largely ignore. So there are different definitions of positive aging. There isn't really a consensus yet. But what is nice about it is that it addresses the multidimensionality of what it means to age well. So things that are to do with physical health and functioning, as well as social engagement, cognitive performance, well-being, which I quite like, personal resources, life involvement, extrinsic factors. So as a cross-cultural psychologist, I like it that it pays a bit more attention to the contextual factors as well. Because yes, individually, we may want to do as well as we can, but if the society or the community doesn't allow us to do that, then we can't. So it's good that it's paying attention to that extrinsic factor as well. So because not many people are doing that research, I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. So I began a program of research, and I was very lucky to have really good collaborators. So the first study that I conducted, this was during COVID times. So I decided to conduct a very exploratory qualitative study, just asking older adults what they thought of positive aging to be. Yeah. So I think that subjective experience is really important. So I am a huge believer in co-production in research, that we don't just impose ideas on them, but we actually hear their voice. We actually talk to them, the group that we are trying to study, and we try to kind of get their perspective on things. So that's kind of where I began. I was like, I want to know what positive aging meant for people who are in that age group or who are aging in the way that they see it. So the definition of positive aging also varies. So I think a lot of the times we pay attention to the objective kind of conceptualization, but I was interested in that kind of subjective conceptualization. So I'm not going to go into too much detail of that, but paying attention to that kind of developmental functional approach of what the society does, how the individual understands the kind of situational factors, and yeah, what it meant to kind of have a life as an older adult. So that lived experience was another thing that I was really interested in. And the reason why this is important is because it's important for people to feel well, that they have a relatively good subjective kind of sense of aging for them to actually have good life. We know that the actual longevity depends partially on how they feel themselves. So the less negative the older adults feel about their own aging, the more likely that they're going to have a better, healthier, longer life. So that's another reason why we need to be looking at this. So we were lucky enough to recruit participants. So this being the times of COVID, we were initially worried that we may not get enough participants, or with the question of digital literacy in mind, whether they would be comfortable enough conducting online interviews. But luckily, many of them were. But that also puts a bit of limitation that this is a bit of a biased sample, because these are older adults who are technologically savvy enough to be able to use such softwares. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So those who consider themselves to be in the population were invited for the interview. And at the end, we conducted 15 interviews, lasting an average of about 1 hour. And this was conducted using Microsoft Teams. So the questions, as you will see, were very kind of open and straightforward. So we weren't trying to get to sort of hidden meanings or anything. We just asked them very openly what positive aging meant to them. Do you have an example of someone who's aging positively that you would like to share? What are some of the factors, or what are some of the things that help you to age well? How does your family or people who are close to you support you in that kind of positive aging or aging well process? And I really like IPA as a method, because that really kind of allows us to kind of get the narrative and to be able to make sense of what people are trying to tell you. So for that reason, we conducted an IPA to analyze the data. So these are some example quotes, and I'm sorry that you can't see them very well. If you like the slides, I can email them to you afterwards. So do ask if you want to see the details. But there are a lot of really positive messages. I mean, this was during the lockdown. In the UK, most of these older adults were told to stay home in a very kind of ageist manner. They were kind of like, you are vulnerable, so stay home. Don't risk your life. So we would have thought that, they were very depressed, that they were isolated, unhappy, unwell, missing their family and so on. But many of them seemed actually quite resilient. They were kind of going on, like moving on still, doing with what they can. And what they told us about their aging process was actually relatively positive as well. I mean, many of them had mentioned the kind of limitations because of their physical condition. They were like, oh, I can't move very well. It's painful to do this and that. I can't do this and that anymore. But at the same time, they also had a lot of positive things to say. I mean, they talked about family relationships a lot. And what is good about it was not that they had good family relationship. It wasn't so much that, oh, I have good family relationship and that's why I'm happy. But there were a lot of themes around generativity, of giving something back as well. So yeah, okay, I might be old and I may not be doing that much, but I'm calling on my children and grandparents all the time. I'm trying to be a part of their life. I'm trying to do what I can. One older adult person mentioned about their grandson who was in trouble, and he wanted to do something for that grandchild. He was talking about how he was going to leave some money for him specifically so that he can figure something out, and how he would call him now and then to make sure that he's doing okay and stuff. And many of them were actually really worried about the younger generation. Rather than worrying about themselves, they were worried about the younger generation. They were like, oh, I've heard that, younger generation is not getting jobs, that they don't have a very good salary, that they had these and these, that concern. How can we help them? I feel bad for them. And, I would like to, find ways in which I can help them. Many of them are volunteering. Many of them were doing what they can. One person shared the story of how she would put the plants in her garden in pots and leave them outside her door so people can pick them up. So they were trying to still contribute. They were still trying to stay connected. They were trying to make life more meaningful. And they wanted to make impact on other people's lives too, which I thought was really beautiful. So many of the themes are actually very positive. So not going to go into all the details because I don't have the time, but these were the final themes. So living harmoniously, which really touched upon that intergenerational living as well. So I might die soon, but I want the next generation to live well as well. The value in generativity, of life wanting to continue, preparedness and adaptability, capacity for connection. So not just enjoying connections, but making room for that kind of connection. And once again, wanting to be helpful for others. Autonomy was another big thing. So even if they were kind of bound to house, they still wanted to be independent. They still wanted to, do things on their own. Learning and personal development was still a big theme. They still wanted to learn a lot of things. They were very engaged. Many of them were spending hours each day to learn something new, and that was a big part of their process as well. One person mentioned in the code that I just showed you that they felt like they were kind of going back to childhood where they are open to learning again. They finally have the time and capacity to do it. So they were really enjoying that process and extra time of learning things. And some of them had talked about aging in society. Not many of them were upset or angry at what the society provides them with. But some of them had talked about that ageism, that they get talked in a way that is very kind of like childish, or that the society is not really thinking about how to care for that generation. So there were some themes that were kind of in between or a bit neutral or slightly negative, but they also had a lot of really positive things to say. And negotiating with the realities of aging was another really big thing, that they were trying their best to cope with them. So they were not going to succumb to the challenges and problems, but they were trying to deal with it actively and proactively. So that was really beautiful. So on the basis of our findings, we decided that our definition of positive aging will be subjective, intentional experience and multidimensional construction of aging well. And that's part on intentional experience, I think, is really important. So kind of giving the kind of power back to the older generation, how they are making that intentional experience of their daily lives in old age, despite any of the kind of challenges that they face specifically at that age group. So on the basis of that qualitative piece of research, we conducted, we then wanted to try to measure it as well. So 15 older adults have shared really beautiful stories with us, and we have an idea what positive aging meant. But then how can we then develop this into a quantitative measure that can then be used to test older adults' well-being and sense of positive aging, and how that might be associated with other mental health kind of outcomes. Because, if you are a quantitative researcher, then you want to see that positive aging is actually associated with positive mental health and well-being, right? So that was the first research study that we conducted. So once again, we were lucky enough to have many participants from the UK. So all of the conception that the older adults can't use technology, they can't read things or focus for too long, I think all of that needs to go. The oldest person who completed this online questionnaire of more than 100 items was 98. Yeah, completed it. So, once again, I think the way that we are thinking about older adults is possibly a bit biased. So we tested our new scale, which initially contained 18 items. So these items were based on the themes and the kind of codes that we collected in the first qualitative study. And then we measured cognitive functioning, and we measured psychological well-being. And then there was a single item physical health measure. Sorry, you can't read that. In the final sample of 501, we actually had I'm not testing your eyesight. And see, we may not be older adults, but we still can't read. So, So it was a relatively diverse sample. It was collected across the UK. We contacted many of the groups where we saw that there will be lots of older adults, and many of them were kind enough to complete this questionnaire. And the key findings, once again, I don't have the time to share all the findings, But we conducted both exploratory and confirmatory effect analysis with the new scale. And at the end of many iterations of the models that we ran, we decided that the final scale containing 8 of the items, which I'm going to show you later, was the best fit and possibly the best way to measure positive aging. So the fit of the final model containing those 8 items was pretty good. And another thing that was quite good is that scale worked quite well for both those under 75 of age and over 75 of age. And nicely enough for us, the positive aging scale, the scores were correlated significantly with cognitive functioning, general health, and both hedonistic and eudaimonic well-being. So that kind of makes us think that we've created a good scale that can be used. So that is the final scale, and it is open for anyone to use. If you send me an email, I'm more than happy to send you the scale along with the paper that's currently under review. And I want to pay a bit of attention to the language here. So the previous scales of aging were all a bit negative. It was things to do with, I don't have illness, or I am feeling relatively okay, things like that. But if you look at our scale, we made sure that the language stayed quite positive. And you can also see that it's a bit multidimensional in the sense that the kind of social connection part is a big one. And also being part of the community, and also things to do with personal development and that kind of self-fulfillment. So I really like the last item of the mental stimulation. I mean, we tend to think that the older adults just want to stay quiet in the countryside somewhere and just, not be bothered by anyone. But no, they wanted the mental stimulation. They kept in touch with what was going on around the world. Compared to my British undergrad students, they knew much better what was going on around the world. When we talked to our students about what's going on, like the war and stuff, they're kind of like, where is that? But, these older adults that we tested, they were very aware of what was going on, and they wanted the mental stimulation. They wanted to learn. They wanted to improve. They wanted to be a better person. Doing things that I enjoy. So that sense of keeping on or moving on and keep going was a big part of it. So all of the items seem to capture that sense of positive aging in the way that I wanted quite well. So as a researcher, I'm always thinking about what next. And I don't want this series of research to just end with those 2 studies. I want to try to expand it as much as I can so that all of us have a better idea of what positive aging means and how that accounts for a lot of other outcomes. So ultimately, how can we help all of us to age more positively? And once again, pay attention to the language. I'm not saying how can we help them, but how can we help ourselves age more positively so that we don't feel like one day we are just going to sit in the back room and not do anything, but how can we kind of continue on the being of who we are in the way that is most optimal is sort of the approach that I'm suggesting here. So the first thing that I would like to do, and that's partly why I'm here, to connect with people to see whether I can find collaborators to help expand on this. So I want to look a bit further at family support and positive aging, because even looking at the relatively individualistic British sample, social connection and that meaning-making through connection was an important part. So that's one aspect that I want to look at further, and also further conceptual analysis of positive aging. And here I do want to kind of touch upon the kind of philosophical foundations. So the kind of Asian values of generativity, of giving something back. Gratitude is another big part of it, and also the kind of dialectical thinking. So those of us in Asia, we tend to think that if there's something bad, there's something good as well. So aging might be really bad, but at the same time, it comes with some benefits. So I want to apply that kind of thinking. I would like to engage with more interdisciplinary kind of approaches, looking at positive aging, borrowing upon those concepts. And also culture and cross-cultural examination of what it means to age positively. So I think we need to once again understand that aging happens differently in different places, and the cultural context does have an impact on how people age. So looking at that, trying to include more cultures in the study so that we don't apply the kind of westernized or weird kind of definitions and conceptualizations and findings upon populations where the realities of life might be very different. And also kind of moving on to the next stage of thinking about interventions. So research-wise or scientific evidence-wise, we can kind of see what positive aging might mean, but then how can we then apply this to possible interventions so that we can actually work together with older adults in kind of getting them to age more positively, or to kind of engage different generations of people together so that we can create a space where people can kind of talk about this or kind of interact with each other in the ways that are more positive. So Daniele, who's sitting somewhere in the room, is going to work with me in looking at this a bit further. So we are going to create a study that is co-produced, meaning we are going to develop things together with older adults from the beginning, talking to them. And one aspect of that will be the kind of reflections of on aging process and positive aging, and also reducing sedentary behavior. So the kind of body and mind going together is the angle that we are going to approach this in. Right, so special thanks to my amazing collaborators and the references. And finally, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Park.